People say, no one can drive you out of the very house you once saved. I used to believe that too until that night in Prairie Hill when my daughter-in-law stood up in the middle of dinner, pointed at me and said, "You should move out. This house is needed for someone else." No one reacted. Only the sound of cutlery stopped, and the forced smiles of people who thought they had the right to command. My son, Neil, bowed his head. Her parents laughed and raised their glasses as if witnessing some kind of liberation ceremony. I sat there, in the room I had paid off and repaired with my own hands, listening to every word fall like nails driven into memories. I said nothing. I just stood up, put on my coat, placed my keys on the table, and said, "Now it all belongs to you." If you have ever been driven out of someone's life by your own family, looked down on because you were no longer useful, or robbed of what you sacrificed to preserve, stay, because this story will show you that revenge needs no shouting, no violence. It only needs someone silent enough to calculate the perfect timing. Follow, turn on notifications, and comment your city, so I'll know that somewhere there are still people who believe justice doesn't need an audience, only someone patient enough to turn pain into a perfect design. I once thought that after 68 years of living on the Arizona plains, I understood silence, the kind of silence in the grasslands at dusk when the wind stops and there are no insects. But that night, in my son's house in Prairie Hill, I learned another kind of silence. Silence with intent. Silence used as a weapon. I walked into the 2-story brick house. The smell of stew and sauce still lingered in the air. On the dining table, 6 sets of dishes were neatly arranged, precise as if prepared for a performance. I counted them twice, then looked around. My son Neil was already sitting at the head of the table, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, eyes fixed on his plate as if hiding. Amber, my daughter-in-law, moved between the kitchen and table, slicing bread with a kind of cold precision. "Quite a formal dinner tonight," I said, trying to sound light. Amber didn't turn around, only answered flatly, "Dinner's almost ready," as if speaking to the room, not to me. I hung up my coat, my hand brushing the inner pocket where I always kept a photo of my wife, Elaine. Our wedding photo from 1974, she in her white dress, smiling gently. I always touched it when entering Neil's house, a small habit to remind myself. Be patient. The doorbell rang. Amber's face suddenly lit up, as if freed from the heavy air pressing over the table. "They're here," she said. The door opened and Clarence and Eileen Carter, Amber's parents, walked in, dragging 2 rolling suitcases. "My, this house is lovely," Eileen said, laughing, her eyes scanning the room. "Finally, a proper place to—" "Live," Clarence said in a booming voice, like he owned the place. I froze for a moment. A proper place to live. I looked at Neil. My son stayed silent, twirling his glass of water, avoiding my eyes. When everyone sat down, Clarence naturally took the head seat, the one that should have been Neil's. No one objected. The conversation buzzed with trivialities. Golf, a neighbor fined for painting the fence the wrong color, stories that had nothing to do with me. I ate without tasting anything but the sound of silverware. Then suddenly Amber stood up. The chair scraped across the hardwood floor with a shrill sound. She crossed her arms, looked straight at me, and spoke with the tone of a formal announcement. "Dad Walter, we've decided my parents will take the downstairs room. You can move out next week." The whole table went silent. Clarence adjusted his tie, and Eileen smiled faintly. I set my fork down, looked straight at Amber, and forced calm into my voice. "That room is mine. I've lived there for 3 years. Where exactly should I go?" Amber tilted her head, voice cold. "Well, we have a guest room upstairs, but my mom can't climb stairs. Just a few weeks. Besides," she paused, scanning me, "you've lived here rent-free long enough?" That sentence hit like a slap. My fork dropped onto the plate with a sharp clang. For a second I saw Mr. Patterson, the neighbor, watering his lawn outside, looking up through the window. He must have heard. I looked around the table. Clarence was pouring more wine, Eileen dabbing her lips, and Neil, the son I'd raised and educated, just sat there, head bowed. I called softly, "Neil?" He swallowed hard, muttered like surrender. "Maybe we can figure something out." Amber cut in sharply. "No need to figure anything. It's decided." I stood up. The chair screeched against the floor. The air was so thick I could hear my heartbeat. I opened the cabinet, took my coat. In the pocket, my fingers touched a silver pen, the same one I used to sign a check for $180,000 to the bank, saving this house from foreclosure 4 years ago. Amber said, with relief and a hint of contempt, "Finally cooperating." I walked to the door, paused for a moment, looked around the room one last time. Their wedding photo, the dining table I bought for them, the chandelier I had rewired myself. Everything was still there, except decency. I placed my keys on the shelf by the door and said slowly, "Now it all belongs to you." No one spoke. I opened the door. Cold air hit my face. Nebraska in April was still biting. The porch light from Patterson's yard cast long shadows on the grass. He glanced at me, nodded slightly, the nod of a man who understands without asking. I called a taxi. When it arrived, I turned back toward the house I had once saved. Through the window, yellow light spilled out, framing 4 people laughing at the table. On the floor lay a broken glass, wine spreading like a wound. I didn't know who dropped it. Maybe them, maybe me. But that sound, the sound of breaking, was the period ending what used to be family. The young taxi driver glanced at me in the mirror. "Rough night, sir?" he asked. I looked out the window, watching Prairie Hill's lights fade behind us. "Not exactly rough," I said quietly. "Just eye-opening." That night, I didn't realize I was walking away from a house, but into a plan built on silence, on numbers, and on the patience of a father once considered useless. As the taxi left Prairie Hill, I looked through the window, the lights of their house fading behind me like a strip of memory being scraped away. 3 years earlier, after Elaine passed, I'd sold our old home in Lincoln, where we had lived for more than 30 years. I couldn't bear walking through the kitchen and still hearing her laughter, or the sound of the kettle boiling each morning. The proceeds, about $400,000, I split into 2 parts, one for bonds and the other to buy a small rental property, along with another house I had owned for over a decade, which gave me 2 stable income sources each month. Right after selling the house, I rented a small apartment near Holmes Lake, south of Lincoln. It had only 1 bedroom, but the balcony faced the water, where every morning I could brew coffee and hear wild ducks flapping their wings. I planted a few pots of mint, kept some small fish, sometimes drove to the pier to fish, and in the evenings wrote life notes into Elaine's old journal. A quiet but peaceful life. I thought I would live that way until the end. Then one rainy afternoon that year, the phone rang. Neil's voice came through. Panicked, "Dad, the bank is about to seize the house. I just need another $180,000 to keep it." I didn't hesitate. I only asked, "Are you sure that's all?" He said, "If we can get through this month, we'll be fine." I didn't ask more. I said, "All right, I'll send it tomorrow." The next day, we met in an old diner in Lincoln. Neil placed a stack of bank papers on the table, his hands trembling so badly that the water glass shook. Amber sat beside him, eyes red. I unfolded the paper. The red words, "Final Notice," jumped out. I had seen plenty of numbers in my life as an engineer, but none had ever hurt like that. I took out my silver pen and signed a check for $180,000. As I handed it to my son, I said, "Save your home. Don't let your wife be afraid." Amber cried and held my hand. Neil hugged me and said, "I'll pay you back, I promise." I smiled. "No need. Just remember." In that moment, I heard Elaine's voice in my head. "Don't make them owe you, Walter. Just make them remember you." They kept their house, and from then on, Neil and Amber believed that was all I had, that I had given them my last dollar. I thought I was doing the right thing. A month later, Neil said, "Dad, don't live alone anymore. Come stay with us, it'll be fun." Amber nodded, but her eyes didn't match her smile. To her, I was just an old man without a house or worth, living on borrowed grace, and I believed in that supposed kindness. The years living with them slid downhill like a slow slope. When Neil and Amber got back on their feet, they said they needed a little extra to fix the yard and replace the awning. I wrote a check for $15,000. When Amber's car broke down, I gave $8,000 so they could buy another. And for 3 years straight, I transferred $1,200 each month. Insurance, tuition, groceries. Always temporary. Everything ran smoothly, automatically, like a habit powered by affection. Now, in the Hampton Inn room on McDowell Road, I open my laptop, the screen light reflecting off the old face in the mirror. I type the numbers. 180,000 saved their house. 15,000 repairs and expenses after the crisis. 8,000 car. 43,200 living support for 3 years. Total $246,200 and not a single cent repaid. I leaned back in the chair, eyes closed. Elaine had been right. Kindness doesn't need repayment, but it deserves to be remembered, and I had simply been forgotten. I opened another file, personal finance. 40 years of engineering work and careful investing had built me a solid foundation. Retirement fund, $520,000. Stocks and bonds, $890,000. Cash and CDs, $470,000. 2 rental houses in Lincoln, $580,000. Income $3,400 per month. Net worth $2.8 million. Passive income $7,600 per month. To Neil and Amber, I was a poor old man living off their generosity. In reality, I was only silent, watching and waiting for the right time. I closed the laptop, looked at the clock. 11:47. Somewhere across the city, Neil and Amber were asleep, believing they had removed a burden. I smiled faintly. I have numbers. They have pride. Let's see which lasts longer. I turned off the light, lay down, and listened to the rain against the window. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake. Justice isn't a sword. It only needs someone patient enough to strike at the right moment. The next morning, as the first light slipped through the hotel curtains, I brewed a cup of black coffee. The scent of roasted beans filled the cold room, a smell that stirred both alertness and memory. On the table, the laptop was still open from the night before, rows of numbers, accounts, cash flow, and dense spreadsheets. I looked at them and felt no anger anymore, only the calm of a man accustomed to analysis, to planning, to turning numbers into strategy. 40 years in financial engineering had taught me one thing. Every problem, no matter how emotional it appears, can be solved through logic. I opened the browser and typed Zillow, Oak Street, Phoenix. The results appeared instantly. I scrolled down the listings until a familiar image caught my eye. For sale, $685,000, Sonoran Realty. I stopped. The address was directly across from Neil's house. A 2-story home, old white paint, and slightly faded window frames. But the structure looked solid, and the front yard was shaded by trees that softened the sun. I leaned back in my chair, lips curling into a thin smile. Sometimes opportunity shows up as nothing more than a wooden sign. I called the number listed. A woman's voice answered, calm and professional. Sonoran Realty. This is Margaret Collins. How may I help you? I'm interested in the property on Oak Street. Is it still on the market? Yes, sir. The owner needs to sell quickly because of a job transfer to California. Would you like to see it today? I'm free this afternoon. How about 2 o'clock? I'll meet you there. Her tone reminded me of Elaine, composed but with a touch of empathy beyond what words reveal. I closed the laptop, took a sip of coffee, and thought, perhaps this was the starting point I had been waiting for these 3 years. At 2 in the afternoon, I drove back to Oak Street. The March sunlight of Arizona bounced off the windshield, glimmering across the smooth pavement. From a distance, I could already see the house across the street. The for sale sign tilted slightly in the breeze, the Sonoran Realty lettering still new, untouched by the sun. That house stood directly opposite the one where I'd been cast out, less than 30 meters away, a perfect distance to see everything clearly. Margaret's silver Lexus was already parked outside. She greeted me with a firm handshake. "Mr. Hill? Nice to meet you. I've already opened the door." I nodded. "Call me Walter." Inside, the house carried that faint scent of emptiness. Paint and dry wood mixed. Margaret pulled open the curtains, letting sunlight pour in. This house was built in 1967. The current owners, the Carlsons, want to close quickly, no drawn-out negotiations. I walked slowly down the hallway, brushing my hand along the wooden railing. Everything was sturdy, just needed paint. The living room was spacious, the old hardwood floors still solid. The kitchen window looked directly out to the front yard, and across the street, straight to Neil's house. Margaret led me upstairs and stopped before a front-facing room. They used this as a reading room. Lots of natural light, full street view. I stepped to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Through the glass, I saw Neil's roofline, his garage entrance, even the window where Amber often stood watering her plants. Margaret smiled. "Nice view, isn't it?" "I prefer the facing direction," I replied. She tilted her head slightly as if curious, then gestured toward the hallway. "All electrical and plumbing systems are regularly inspected. The owners are open to negotiation. They're hoping to find a buyer within 10 days. "I can pay cash," I said. "No mortgage, no contingencies." Margaret's eyebrows lifted. "In that case, I believe they'd accept $650,000. They're desperate to leave. For a cash buyer, that's hard to refuse." I paused for a moment, then opened my briefcase. Inside was the same silver pen I'd used to sign the check that saved Neil's home 3 years ago. I rolled it between my fingers, watching the light glint off the metal. "Let's do it now, Margaret." She nodded briskly. "I'll call the escrow office at First Arizona Bank. If you're ready, we can place the deposit today." By 3:30, we were sitting in a small conference room at the bank. No dramatics, no grand speeches, just numbers and legality. I wired $50,000 as the deposit. The bank officer printed the confirmation and stamped it in red. Margaret smiled as she handed me the folder. "With your efficiency, I think they'll accept immediately." I set the pen to paper and signed Walter Hill in a round, steady stroke. The same silver pen once used to rescue someone else's house. The moment the ink touched the page, I realized something. I was no longer the man being pushed out. I was the one choosing where to stand. Before I left, Margaret shook my hand again. "Escrow will close in 10 days. Call me if you need anything." I nodded. "Thank you." By the time I returned to the hotel, dusk had fallen. The streetlights glowed gold on the damp pavement after a light rain. I poured another cup of coffee and placed the silver pen neatly beside the transfer confirmation. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "Offer accepted. Congratulations, Mr. Hill." I stared at the words on the screen, leaned back in my chair, and smiled, a faint glimmer crossing my face like a ripple of light across still water. The game had begun. The day the house was handed over, the Arizona sky was impossibly blue. Morning light glowed against the terracotta roof tiles, illuminating the small sign on the lawn. Sold, Sonoran Realty. I signed the final transfer documents at the First Arizona Bank office. Everything was legal, and escrow was completed in exactly 10 days. The bank clerk handed me 2 brass-colored keys, the keys to a new beginning. That afternoon, I stepped into a house still smelling faintly of paint. The sound of the door closing echoed deep and certain, like the sound of the past sealing itself shut. The dry wooden floor creaked softly beneath my feet, and the walls carried streaks of time. The house wasn't large, but it had a solid spine. Something. I've always believed every structure, like every plan, must have. I called Carlos, the contractor Margaret had recommended. His voice was rough and seasoned. How soon do you want it finished? 5 days. He paused. If it has to be that fast, I'll need 2 crews. It'll cost around $28,000. I don't bargain, I replied. I need to start work soon. The next afternoon, 2 trucks pulled up in front of the house. Painters, electricians, carpenters, they all poured in. The early access permit I'd arranged through the bank allowed renovation before the official move-in date, perfectly within the rules. They replaced bulbs, sanded floors, painted walls, and refinished the staircase. For the upstairs room, the one facing Neil's house, I gave precise instructions. Charcoal gray paint. Polish the shelves. Add a desk lamp. I need it to look like an office, not a living room. Carlos chuckled. An office, huh? I nodded. An observation room. 5 days passed like a steady rhythm of labor. The hum of floor sanders mixed with the scent of fresh paint. The hammering blending with the desert wind outside. Each evening I stood on the porch, watching the crews clean up, remembering my years as an engineer, methodical, precise, never rushed. People may forget kindness, but they never forget the feeling of being watched. On the 5th day, the house was completely transformed. The wood floors gleamed honey gold, the walls smooth and dry, the windows polished until they mirrored the sky. In the upstairs room, the oak desk stood exactly where I wanted, facing the wide window that looked straight across the street. I hung an old photograph of Elaine on the wall, taken at Holmes Lake, her smiling with a cup of coffee in hand, the wind lifting her silver hair. That photo had sat on my desk for 10 years. Now it returned to its rightful place, the center of my view. Beneath it, I set her white porcelain coffee mug, the one she used every morning. It was now the first relic of this new house. The next morning I brewed coffee and sat at the desk. Dawn light spilled through the wide glass pane. Across the street, Neil's house stood clearly in sight. The living room curtains were open and Amber's car was parked in the driveway. I could see their silhouettes moving in the kitchen, familiar motions, but now I was the one observing. 2 windows, 2 worlds, one filled with noise and disorder, the other with silence and order. One ruled by debt and pretense. The other is by plan and control. Across that 30-meter distance, I felt as though an invisible bridge connected us, not made of wood or steel, but of memory and leverage. At noon, I walked through the small garden. Cacti grew among white stones, and the dry wind carried the scent of sand and sunlight. I felt like I'd returned to my younger days, building bridges. Every weld, every number had to be exact. This new structure was the same, only now the materials were silence and truth. By evening, Carlos packed up his tools. All done, Mr. Hill. Now this house is truly worth living in. I nodded, handing him an envelope. Thank you, Carlos. You did great work. He smiled kindly. I just handled the wood. The delicate part seems to be yours. After they left, I stood alone in the quiet house, listening to the wind slip through the gaps in the frame. I walked to the window and looked across. Neil's lights were on. From the living room, I saw Amber pacing, phone in hand, talking fast, while Neil sat still at the table, his face weary. The scene was familiar, but now it looked like a play, restaged just for me to watch from the front row. I sipped my coffee, the heat spreading down my throat. The sun was setting, its last light crossing the glass. In the reflection, I saw 2 windows, one theirs, one mine, mirroring the same story, but heading toward 2 different endings. I spoke softly to myself, and perhaps to Elaine. The best view is always earned. Monday morning, the Phoenix sky was so clear it was almost blinding. The early sunlight poured over the quiet row of houses, glinting off windows still glazed with dew. I woke earlier than usual, brewed a pot of freshly roasted coffee, its bold aroma filling the cool kitchen. The white porcelain cup, Elaine's old one, fit perfectly in my hand, warm and heavy. Every motion was deliberate. Opening the curtains, straightening my collar, stepping out onto the porch. Across the street, the curtain in Neil's house shifted. Light filtered through the thin fabric, and then a silhouette appeared. I recognized the shape. Amber. She was still in her cream-colored nightgown, hair tied up, coffee cup in hand. I saw the moment her eyes turned toward me. Brief, but enough for her expression to freeze, as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. 30 meters of silence stretched between our houses. I smiled. I lifted my cup, tilted my head slightly, and spoke loud enough for the sound to carry clearly across the street. Calm, natural, without anger. "Good morning, neighbor." My voice was steady, low, not provocative, but impossible to ignore. In that instant, something cracked like glass under strain. Amber froze. Her hand trembled and the coffee cup slipped, shattering against the floor. Brown liquid splattered across her nightgown and the carpet, and in the sunlight, the droplets gleamed like tiny streaks of blood on a bright canvas. She stumbled back, mouth open, no sound coming out. From a distance, I saw Neil step behind her, looking confused. At that same moment, old Mr. Patterson, the neighbor on the corner, was walking his dog past the street. He looked up, spotted me on the porch, and grinned, raising his hand. "Morning, Walter. Didn't know you moved in here." I answered cheerfully. "Just across the street. Closer to family now." The words sounded harmless, but they carried clean and sharp through the quiet air, gliding on the wind until they landed squarely inside Neil's open window. Patterson laughed, oblivious, and walked on. I took a sip of coffee, glancing over. Amber was still standing there, her face pale, eyes wide, hands clenched tight. In the background, Neil stepped closer to the window. Our eyes met. I lifted my cup slightly, smiling, polite, calm, like greeting an old acquaintance after a long absence. Neil touched his wife's shoulder, said something, but she pulled away, turned, and disappeared behind the curtain that snapped shut. Fast, hard, as if to block both the light and the fear seeping in. I stayed where I was. The sun rose higher, cutting a golden line across the pavement between our houses. Through the reflection in the glass, I saw my image superimposed on their window. Two figures sharing one frame, yet living in different worlds. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but something inside me was warming again. Not anger, control. For 3 years they had grown used to my silence, my restraint, my retreat. Today I took one step onto the porch, and their world shook. I turned, set the cup down on the small wooden table beside the window, right next to Elaine's photo. The light caught the glass, merging her face and mine in the same reflection. "That was the moment she realized," I murmured, as if making a note for myself. I hadn't disappeared. I'd relocated. 3 days after I said, "Good morning, neighbors," I drove into downtown Phoenix. The midday sun blazed over the I-10 freeway, the air hot and dry, but my mind was strikingly clear. I had observed enough. It was time to shift from observation to action. The Chen and Associates building sat in an older office complex near First Arizona Bank. Robert Chen, a Taiwanese-American attorney in his 60s, was known for his cold precision. I had met him years earlier while helping a colleague settle a property dispute. He never asked whether a client was angry. Only, "Do you have evidence?" I stepped inside and handed him an envelope. Bank statements, emails, text messages, photocopies of checks, and transfer receipts. Robert examined each page, nodding slightly. "You want to press criminal charges?" he asked. "I want something that makes them face themselves," I replied. "No noise, just the law." He smiled faintly. "Arizona allows an unjust enrichment claim. If you have proof of transfers and email confirmations, we can send a notice of claim within 14 days. If they stay silent, we file in court. No verbal negotiation," I asked. "Will that be enough to get their attention?" He raised an eyebrow. A signed and stamped attorney letter always wakes people up. We finalized the details. He would draft the letter, I'd sign the authorization, and a filed copy would be sent to me the same day the original went out. I reminded him, no threats, just facts. Robert nodded. I don't write threats. I write consequences. As I left his office, the secretary handed me the retainer invoice, $3,500. I signed it with the same silver pen I had once used to save Neil's house. That small act felt like closing a circle. The first time I signed to save them. This time, I signed to save my dignity. Outside, the Phoenix sun was unforgiving. I stopped at a cafe across the street, ordered a black coffee, opened my laptop, and typed the final line in my plan file. Day 0. Consulted legal counsel. Action commences. When I hit save, I knew I had crossed the line between victim and strategist. 3 years ago, I had signed a check to save them from losing their home. Today, I signed a document to reclaim my honor. 3 days after I left Robert Chen's office, the first envelope arrived on the doorstep. The morning after the good morning that had stirred the whole street, the atmosphere on Oak Street felt heavy, as if a thin sheet of paper had been stretched over everyone's face. I did not rush to be pleased. The plan still had many stages, and now came the part where the law would speak for me. Around noon, the postal worker set a thick envelope on the porch. Printed on the envelope in sober type was Robert Chen, attorney at law, letterhead crisp and professional. I held the envelope, examined the 6 digits in the upper right corner, the sending date, the postal code, the postmark. I set it on the table, poured a cup of tea, and sat down as if reading the newspaper. Inside was a letter. The large heading in the center read, Notice of Claim, Loan Repayment, $180,000. Those capital letters were enough to make a casual reader startle. I opened the letter slowly. The content was short, clear, and procedural. It listed the transferred amount, the transfer dates, the invoices, bank statements noting loan to Neil Hill, emails, and confirming messages. The final paragraph stated plainly, if there is no response within 14 days, civil action will be taken to recover the debt, plus interest and legal costs. The letter's tone was calm and cold, not vindictive, but calculated. Across the street, Amber received a copy. She was cleaning the kitchen when her eyes landed on the envelope with the lawyer's seal. At first, she thought it was junk mail, but when she read the heading, her face went pale. Her hands trembled as she opened the letter. Words like loan, demand, legal action danced on the page, and everything around her seemed to stop. Clarence, her father, heard the noise and ran in, eyes wide. Eileen covered her mouth and began to babble. Frantic questions. Neil, what is this? Did you do something? Neil, in the living room, heard his wife's trembling voice and came over, holding the letter but not daring to open it. They panicked. The reactions were plain. Clarence flushed, muttering about lawyer fees and retainers. Eileen cried softly, not for the money, but for what the neighborhood would think when a notice arrived at their door. They spun like a top, calling friends, calling a banker acquaintance, calling neighbors, all the frantic moves of a family whose sense of safety had suddenly trembled. Meanwhile, in my new house, I heard the phone ring in my hand, but did not look. I placed the second letter, the copy Robert Chen had prepared, into the file clip on the desk. I took a label, scribbled, copy filed, 1/6, clipped it closed, and carefully slid it into the green-marked document drawer. That action, for me, was not an act of hatred, but a procedure. Record, archive, prepare evidence. I turned on the radio. Moon River drifted softly through the room, the saxophone like oil over water. The song made everything look both beautiful and futile. I held the teacup and watched Oak Street through the window. Their curtains still fluttered. In my head, I kept repeating the lines from the letter. Transfer dates, account numbers, repayment promises. Everything was now digitized and certified, and that was the power. I had been careful throughout the process. Bank statements, screenshots of transfers, emails, messages, all saved. Arizona law recognizes unjust enrichment, a simple legal concept. If someone benefits at another's expense without a legal basis, the injured party can demand restitution. When words are combined with electronic evidence, ownership records, transfers, stored copies, then oral promises stop being mere words and become investigable facts. I did not lay everything out at once. I typed, saved, and organized slowly. The phone rang. Neil called. I saw his name on the screen. My chest tightened slightly, but my voice remained calm. "Dad, can we keep this private? I will pay back. I'll set up a repayment plan. Please don't make a big deal." His voice was pleading, half begging. I listened. I put the cup down and answered in a short, cold tone, like reading a statement. "Everything's already with counsel." Neil was silent on the line. Perhaps he had hoped I would soften, retract the letter, settle privately. But everything had already been handed to counsel. Once the law steps in, reprieves become complicated. I no longer wanted him to repay with words. I wanted repayment through action, through responsibility, by standing up and accepting the consequences of the choices he had made. After I hung up, Moon River still flowed quietly in the house. I felt that this legal strike, the mailed letter, the filed copy, the formal procedure, would unmoor their shameless pride. People can ignore an old man, but they cannot ignore a document bearing a legal seal. And when words require proof, I had the proof ready. This was only the first step. The lawyer's letter was like a stone tossed into a still pond. Its ripples would touch more than one family. Clarence and Eileen began to think about friends and reputation. Amber would feel ashamed before colleagues. Neil would face legal costs he had not foreseen. My aim was not to destroy them utterly. I wanted them to remember. I wanted them to feel the consequences of treating a father like disposable goods. I lifted the teacup and took a sip. In that quiet moment, I knew I had flipped a switch. Now the light would expand, and the curtains they had drawn would be hard to close again. On a cool afternoon, sunlight sliced across the new wooden floor in long bands. I was sitting at the table with several notebooks open and a cold cup of coffee by my side when the doorbell rang. It was not a delivery. The voice outside was hurried and hesitant. "Mr. Hill? Are you home?" I knew immediately who it was. Neil and Amber stood at the gate. Neil's head bowed like a man exhausted from a sleepless night, and Amber was clutching her purse, her eyes still red. They entered slowly, as if visiting a place they once called home but now found strange. I opened the door and smiled politely. "Come in." They sat on the single sofa. I had bought it the day I moved in, and looked around as if measuring the situation. I stood, poured 2 cups of coffee, the deep aroma of freshly ground beans spreading through the room. The casual, intimate gesture was in stark contrast to the tightness in their chests. I handed a cup to Neil, set one down for Amber, then sat across from them. Silence hung for a few seconds. Then Amber burst out with a bitter, mocking edge. "You did all this to get attention?" The question was hollow, intentionally belittling. I set my cup down and looked straight at her. No smile, no blame, my voice cold and steady. "No, out of responsibility. That is what adults call it." The answer acted like a mirror. Amber flushed, not from insult, but because she recognized she had been reflected at herself in the language of someone civilized. No shouting, no name-calling, just naming actions with proper words. Neil bowed his head, hands shaking, the cup leaving his lips untouched. "Dad, can we talk privately? Have you considered—" He tried, each word a fragile bridge. Amber would not let him finish. She stood, approached me, her face flushed. "You will regret this. You will see." Her voice broke, half threat, half plea. I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at her with unwavering calm. The only regret here is how cheap self-respect has become. The words hung in the room like a cold blade. Quiet, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through every defensive argument. Amber reeled as if struck where no one could see. She gaped, stepped back. Neil looked up, his face ashen. From beyond the fence, the sound of footsteps rustled. Mr. Patterson, the corner neighbor, was mowing his lawn, and his eyes happened to pause at the window where everything played out. He stopped mowing, peered through the gap in the fence, and whispered something to his companion. Those whispered words would soon spread, the testimony of an unwitting witness to this event. Unable to bear being exposed before the neighborhood, Amber shouted, "You are cruel!" then grabbed Neil's hand and pulled them toward the door. Neil tried to look back. His eyes were full of chaos, half shame, half regret. Before the door slammed, I heard Amber hiss softly but clearly, "You will pay for this." The door shut, and their footsteps faded down the path. I stood alone, my cup of coffee still steaming, my face cool as if accustomed to this. I placed my palm on the glass and looked across to the house opposite. The curtains now slammed shut, as if trying to hide everything. In that quiet moment, I thought of Elaine, how she had reminded me to keep dignity, how she had gently taught me to speak truth without debasing myself. I smiled, a smile both sweet and bitter. The public shaming of the upstairs scene, smaller than the morning, good morning, but deeper on a personal level, was complete. They left with something that would follow them home, the feeling of exposure, forced to confront their behavior. For me, I knew this was only a step in between. This blow would not destroy them, but it would unsettle the comfortable foundation on which they had stood. I raised the cup and took a sip. The bitter taste passed like a reminder. Justice need not be noisy. Sometimes it only needs the right sentence in the right place. That morning, the Phoenix sky was so clear, it seemed nothing could disturb it. I sat at my desk, the laptop screen glowing, the bank dashboard open. A familiar line appeared. Recurring transfer. $1,200 per month to N Hill account. Active. That line had existed for 3 years, running automatically like the heartbeat of a foolish habit I had once called kindness. I moved the cursor to the Cancel Transfer button. A small window popped up. "Are you sure you want to cancel this automatic transfer?" I clicked. "Yes." The screen flickered. Then a new line appeared. Simple and clean. Transfer canceled. Just 2 words, but heavier than any verdict. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers still on the mouse, a lightness spreading through my chest. No more money would leave my account without my will. Elaine used to say, "Affection without boundaries becomes debt." Today, I have just erased my last debt. Across the city, at the same hour, Neil and Amber were sitting in a small Italian restaurant downtown. Their lunch was the usual: pasta, white wine, a little performance for Amber's colleagues. She needed to impress them before an afternoon meeting. When the bill came, Neil handed over his card with a polite smile. The first card was the main debit, linked directly to their joint checking account, the same one I had been feeding $1,200 into every month for 3 years. Just seeing the card, I could picture the account number I had canceled that morning. The scanner beeped sharply. The red message flashed. Declined. Neil frowned, pulled another card, Amber's secondary debit, the same joint account used for daily expenses, groceries, gas, dining. The waitress tried again and entered the PIN. The second attempt declined. The air around the table froze. The waitress lowered her voice, polite but visibly uneasy. "I'm sorry, both cards were declined." Neil's hand trembled. Sweat glistened on his temple. Amber hurriedly pulled out a third card, a corporate credit card issued for business trips. "Use this," she muttered. The payment went through, but the table had gone silent. Amber's co-workers exchanged awkward glances. Jenna, the youngest blonde at the table, forced a small smile before lowering her eyes to her water glass. Amber tried to laugh. "Must be a banking glitch." But her voice shook, and her eyes were already red. Neil sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table. In his head, the word declined kept repeating, hammering against his pride. I hadn't cut the transfers earlier because that was part of the plan. I waited for the right moment, after the notice of claim was sent, so the financial blow would land while the legal pressure was still fresh. The letter came first to plant fear. The money stopped after to make it real. If I had canceled earlier, they could have blamed a bank error. But now, both hit at once. No room for denial. That afternoon, the house of Clarence and Eileen, Amber's parents, echoed with shouting. Eileen shrieked, her voice sharp. "I told you not to let him near the finances. Now look, everything's gone." Clarence slammed the table. "Shut up. He's humiliating this family on purpose." Neighbors peeked over fences, some shaking their heads, others whispering. From across the street, I could hear faint words carried by the wind. Ruin, money, embarrassing. Then the sound of a door slamming. Silence. I lifted my coffee cup, took a sip, and the afternoon light reflected off the desk and window pane. By evening, their lights flickered. On, off, on again, a visible pulse of unrest. Neil stepped into the yard, threw his phone to the ground, and shouted, "He's ruining us!" The words carried across the street like the echo of a man who had already lost, with no excuses left. I stood at the window, half my face in the light, not happy, not triumphant, just quiet. Beside me, Elaine's photo caught the glow of the lamp. I whispered, "No, he's just starting to learn what fairness feels like." The last wind of the day rustled through the cactus row. Unpaid bills, bank alerts, unanswered calls, all of it would find them soon enough. I didn't need to add anything more. The system would finish the job for me. I sat down, opened my notebook, and typed a simple line. Day 42. Auto transfer canceled. Moral balance restored. Then I closed the book and turned off the light. Across the street, their house still blazed bright, not with life, but with the harsh glare of people trying to hide their collapse. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, the scent of coffee mixing with new wood. There was no victory in my heart, only a calm sense of order. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a judge's gavel. It arrives with a single decisive click. The light on their side flickered. On mine, it stayed steady. July in Phoenix was so hot the pavement seemed to breathe. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, turning Oak Street into a mirage. But the house across the road, the one Neil and Amber once treated as the center of their small universe, now looked like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. I sat in my study, the ceiling fan spinning steadily, the newspaper folded beside a cup of coffee, soft music drifting from the radio. Across the street, they had begun paying for everything they once thought would never catch up. On Monday morning, a middle-aged man I didn't recognize arrived at their house, clipboard in hand. A car buyer. Amber's silver sedan, the one I had paid $8,000 toward, sat in the driveway with a hastily written sign, "For sale, $18,000. The buyer checked a few details, took a test drive, then shook Neil's hand. The deal was quick and cold, as if they were selling something that no longer mattered. Amber stood at the doorway, clutching the curtain, watching the car drive away, her face blank, as if someone had cut out her emotions. 2 days later, the San Diego vacation was canceled. I knew because Neil made the call from the porch, his voice low and tight, trying to stay composed. "We have to cancel the room." "No, we understand the policy." "Yes, it's fine if it's non-refundable." $6,000 wasn't much, but for them now, it was a knife across their pride. Amber threw her phone down on the table and cried out, "He's ruined everything!" Neil said nothing. He sat there, staring at the floor, his back curved like a man who had aged 10 years in a day. On the third day, I saw her leave the house in an old office outfit, a beige checkered dress and a worn leather bag. Amber was heading back to her former school to ask for a part-time teaching job, the same job she'd quit when she thought she had moved up. I watched through the window as she passed my house, her head bowed, avoiding every eye. Her pride had been cut into small pieces, scattered along the same street she once treated as proof of her success. That afternoon, Clarence and Eileen's SUV pulled out of the driveway. Eileen was crying as she climbed into the passenger seat. Clarence just gripped the wheel, not looking back. 5 months of freeloading had taught them their son-in-law was no longer a safety net. They took a few boxes and drove off quietly, leaving behind a stifling house and a young couple sinking into debt. Neil tried to appear strong, but I saw the signs of collapse. He sat on the porch in the mornings, staring into the distance. No more coffee, no laughter. Once, when he accidentally looked up, our eyes met across the sun-soaked lawn. I gave a small nod, no smile. He lowered his gaze like a man who had received his sentence and no longer had the strength to appeal. That evening, the lights across the street dimmed. I heard a window close, the TV fading. In that quiet, I turned on the radio. Moon River played again. I opened the Arizona Republic, reading the financial pages as though other people's lives had nothing to do with mine. Occasionally I glanced up and saw, through the curtain, Amber standing at the second-floor window, looking toward my house. She stood there for a long time, saying nothing, just watching. The reflection of light on the glass made her appear like a ghost clinging to what was already gone. I lifted my cup, took a sip. The room was still, everything finally in its right place. Somewhere down the street came the laughter of children, the scrape of bicycle tires, and the voice of Mr. Patterson behind the fence, talking to a friend walking his dog. That old man sure knows how to keep score. I smiled, not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who had found equilibrium again. Life doesn't always need hard blows. Sometimes you just let people fall into the hole they dug for themselves. I folded the paper, stood, and looked toward the house across the road. Their lights were out, and in that moment I knew their game was over. Monday morning, the sunlight was gentler than usual. The early August wind swept through Oak Street, carrying a mix of desert dust and the faint aroma of coffee from my porch. I was cleaning the window glass when I saw Neil's figure appear across the street. He walked slowly, head down, hands in his pockets, his wrinkled shirt and dusty shoes making him look smaller than I remembered. Amber wasn't with him. The sight reminded me of myself years ago, a man who once believed that silence alone could hold a family together. He stopped at the gate, hesitated for a few seconds, then knocked lightly. "Dad!" his voice rasped. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped out to open the gate. When he entered, I saw in his eyes a blend of shame, fear, and fragile hope, the kind of look that only appears when a man reaches the very end of his pride. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured coffee and placed a cup in front of him. Neil didn't speak right away. He looked around the room, everything neat, every silence in its place. After a moment he exhaled, his hands tightening. "I should have spoken up that day," he said quietly. "When Amber said those things to you, I should have stood up for you. I just sat there, afraid of conflict, afraid of embarrassment. But you didn't deserve that. I should have protected you." I looked at him, my tone calm but firm. "If you truly believe that, then start now. Protecting someone doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with action. Start by defending your integrity." He lifted his head, eyes red, and nodded faintly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just please, don't let this go to court. Amber wouldn't survive it." I was silent for a few seconds, then reached into the drawer and pulled out the old silver pen, the same one that had once signed a check for $180,000. The metal gleamed faintly across the table. I turned to a blank sheet from the file and slowly wrote, "Conditional withdrawal, upon apology." Then I set the pen down and slid the paper toward him. "I'll withdraw the claim," I said deliberately, "if your wife stands in front of me and in front of everyone and apologizes. Not empty words. A real apology. No tears, no excuses. After that, you two handle your finances on your own, pay your debts, and never rely on me again. Only then will I sign to withdraw the case. Neil held the paper, reading each word. His lips parted, but no sound came. Finally he nodded and murmured, "I understand. I'll tell her." He stood, his hands trembling slightly, then bowed deeply. "Thank you for still giving me a chance." As he walked out, sunlight poured across the yard, stretching his shadow down the path. I watched without speaking. In my mind, Elaine's voice drifted in, soft as a breeze. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is when you make someone relearn respect. I placed the silver pen back in its wooden box beside her photograph. On the paper, the words, "Conditional withdrawal upon apology," were still fresh, the ink not yet dry. It wasn't just a legal condition, it was the final boundary of dignity. That afternoon, the sun slanted through the window and spilled across the desk. I turned on the radio. Moon River played again. The melody floated slow and calm, but somewhere inside me, I knew the next storm was coming. Not from the courthouse, but from the heart of a woman who had lost everything and had yet to learn how to bow her head. A week later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Oak Street felt unusually calm. The heat had eased after days of relentless sun. I sat on the porch, coffee cup in hand, eyes drifting over the front page of the Oak Street Chronicle that had just landed on the walkway. The paper still smelled of fresh ink. I opened to the middle spread, and there it was, taking up half a column in bold print. A letter of apology from the Hills. The first line made me stop. We forgot what gratitude means. Mr. Hill reminded us without raising his voice. Beneath it were both signatures, Neil and Amber Hill. The letter wasn't long, but every sentence carried the weight of truth. We allowed pride to replace respect. We mistook kindness for weakness. We hurt a man who had given us more than we ever deserved. It took losing everything to remember what family truly means. We hope to rebuild not what we had, but what we lost. Humility. I read slowly, each line like a confession written by those who had finally understood their own guilt. There was no decoration, no excuse, just honesty. The local paper, printed every Sunday in Phoenix, rarely published personal letters like that, but this time the editor had left it untouched, not a single word removed. From across the street I heard old Mr. Patterson reading aloud to his wife. "Listen to this, Marjorie," he said, half surprised, half impressed. "That old man sure got through to them. Took him long enough, but he did." Then I heard the soft sound of a newspaper folding and his chuckle. "That's class." I set the paper down on the table beside Elaine's photo. Morning light streamed through the window, reflecting off the glass, and for a brief second her smile seemed alive again. I touched the edge of the frame gently and whispered, "See, they said it," without me having to force it. On the table next to the newspaper lay the familiar silver pen. I picked it up, opened a new page in my notebook, and wrote a single line. Letter received. Terms fulfilled. Then I closed the book, feeling a stillness spread through my chest. Not joy, not triumph, just the quiet peace of finally hearing what needed to be said, not through tears, but through words. By noon, a soft wind drifted through the porch. Dry leaves twirled along the pavement. The radio played the familiar notes of Moon River, and across the street, their curtains were no longer tightly drawn. In that moment, I understood that everything had come full circle. No promises, no money, just one public sentence. We forgot what gratitude means. That morning, early autumn sunlight stretched softly across the rooftops of Oak Street. For the first time in months, both houses facing each other were lit at the same time. I stood by the window, the thin curtains swaying in the breeze. Across the street, Amber was watering her plants. She wore a plain shirt, her hair tied neatly back, with none of the arrogance she once wore like armor. When she lifted her head, the sunlight caught her face, and in that moment, she gave a small nod in my direction. No words were spoken, just a simple gesture, yet enough to erase an entire season of resentment. I returned a faint smile, then closed the window, letting the light stay inside. On the table, my silver pen lay beside the old black notebook that had followed me through so many years. I opened to the final page, placed the pen down, and wrote slowly, "Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs witnesses." I closed the notebook and set it beside Elaine's photograph. The light reflected off the glass, spreading a warm glow over her smile. I lifted my coffee cup, the rising steam brushing against my fingers, and realized that some mornings require no words, only quiet to understand that justice has completed its work. Outside, the sound of Amber's watering mixed with the gentle hum of my old radio playing Moon River. The melody drifted through the air like a thin stream, carrying a piece I once thought I had lost. The breeze moved through the window, blending the scents of coffee, earth, and freshly watered plants into something simple and serene. I looked around the house, no longer a refuge of pain, but a testament that silence, when held long enough, can rewrite the order of justice. I took a sip of coffee, letting the mild bitterness fade across my tongue. Across the street, Amber set the watering can down and went back inside. The door closed, sunlight lingering on the frame. I stood, stepping away from the window, leaving the music to fill the space behind me. In the morning light, the coffee still steamed, the radio still sang, and justice, as I had come to believe, needed no audience, no noise, only a witness, and a quiet morning like this to end everything fully. I once thought justice had to sound like a judge's gavel, that it needed applause, lights, and conclusions. But now I know. True justice is silent. It happens in small acts, in the way a person chooses to defend their boundaries without shouting. I didn't destroy anyone. I simply let truth do its work, letting those who mocked kindness see the cost of arrogance. Today, as I sit in this new home, hearing Moon River once more, I know I haven't defeated anyone. I've only defeated myself, my fear, my softness, and my habit of staying silent while others trampled over me. Justice doesn't need applause. It only needs one patient witness and one calm soul waiting for the right moment. If you've ever been betrayed, disrespected, or pushed out of the home you built, don't seek revenge in anger. Seek it in order, in clean records, in silence so sharp it makes the guilty hear their own footsteps echo. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you believe that justice doesn't need noise, only the right witness, leave the name of your city in the comments and hit follow. Because somewhere out there, someone is still using silence to rewrite their own law of fairness. And remember, justice doesn't need an audience. It only needs someone patient enough to witness it.